Humans learn from their mistakes. I cannot. I make no mistakes. So says the Thunderhead from Neal Shusterman's novel by the same name. Here's the thing. The Thunderhead believes that, and it's gloriously, inescapably wrong. But it is an excellent example of the stagnation of the omniscient mind. Arc of a Scythe was a really fascinating read, and today I want to discuss Book 2, Thunderhead, arguably the best of the trilogy, and the one that defined my relationship with the series. I like this series, well, except for Book 3, but that comes later. I recommend this series, again, see the Book 3 caveat, but I fundamentally disagreed with the philosophies in this series. So the whole read turned into a great argument between myself and the pages. And I hope you'll enjoy that too. Welcome to Actually It Is That Deep. As always, this is your spoiler warning. Everything will be spoiled, no holding back. If you haven't read the second book, Thunderhead, this is your final warning. Okay, let's go. As I normally do, we'll start with a summary and my thoughts on the actual events of the book. Our boy Rowan Demish assumes the persona of Scythe Lucifer and hunts down corrupt Scythes. He almost gleans Scythe Brahms, but in the end, Lucifer gives Brahms a second chance. Yeah, that's going to come back to bite him. Anyway. What interested me most about this little part of the story with Rowan doing his own thing is that he was questioning how much good he was doing, which, of course, isn't much. The problem with the Scythedom was a systemic problem. Fixing it with a few murders wasn't gonna solve it. Anyway, while Rowan is playing the Caped Avenger, Citra establishes an unconventional gleaning method as the newly ordained Scythe Anastasia. She gives her subjects a month to get their affairs in order and allows them to choose the way they wish to die. Which, I guess you could arguably call that compassion, but honestly, it just felt like a knife wielded with a velvet glove. Anywho, Tiger, Rowan's old friend, gets recruited by Scythe Rand, who wants him to be her Scythe apprentice, supposedly. And yes, she survived the fire at the end of Book 1. Then we jump to Grayson Tolliver, a boy who has grown up being raised by the Thunderhead and who's training to be a Nimbus agent, which is a servant of the Thunderhead. However, Grayson is persuaded by a senior agent to interfere in the Scythedom affairs, and he ends up saving Scythe Anastasia and Scythe Curie from an attempt on their lives, in which the Thunderhead could not interfere due to its own rules. We'll get back to that. Grayson is expelled from the Nimbus Academy as a result, and the Thunderhead marks Grayson as unsavory, which means that by the Thunderhead's own rules, Grayson and the Thunderhead could not interact. Which was like, seriously? You raised the kid. You used the kid. You sacrificed the kid. Very biblical. Anyway, Grayson embraces the unsavory lifestyle in order to find out what the Thunderhead cannot by finding out what is going on with the Scythes. Guess the kid was a glutton for punishment. He goes to some awful clubs where he meets Purity, a career unsavory with whom he falls in love. His records in the back brain are changed to match his new fabricated identity. We'll come back to the awful clubs because they're important. Anyway. Grayson agrees to help Purity with a job that would aim to kill several Scythes, even though he does not want to do it, and warns the Scythedom anonymously of the attack. The attack is foiled and Purity is gleaned, because of course. Citra helps Grayson flee and instructs him to go to a Thonist monastery. Meanwhile, Rowan learns that Scythe Brahms had gleaned his father, so he goes to the Scythe's home to seek vengeance. No good deed goes unpunished. Anyway, Rowan is captured and taken to Texas, same place as Tiger, who tells him about his training with Scythe Rand. And then Dun dun dun! One day, Rand brings a man into Rowan's room who has Tiger's body and the head of Scythe Goddard. Yes, indeed, somehow Scythe Palpatine has returned. Sorry. Look, the book didn't deserve that, but I dislike resurrecting villains. Anywho, Rand had gleaned Tiger and attached Goddard's head to his body so that Goddard could lead the new order in the Scythedom once more. At the Winter Conclave, Xenocrates announces that he is stepping down as High Blade of Midmerica to become a Grand Slayer on the World Scythe Council. The Old Guard Scythes nominate Scythe Curie as their candidate for High Blade. The New Order Scythes nominate the newly returned Scythe Goddard, because of course they do. Before the results of the vote are released, Citra voices an inquest about Goddard's legitimacy, since only his head, meaning 7% of his body, has been trained and ordained as a Scythe. This inquest postpones the result of the election until the World Scythe Council considers it. It's a really fun bit of bureaucratic politicking. Okay, so we all move to Endura, the place of the Scythes where the Thunderhead can't see. Let me tell you something. Listening to the Grand High Council of Scythes speak, I was like, these people need a French solution, if you follow my drift. And we'll circle back to that idea too. So, Citra and Scythe Curie arrive on Endura for the inquest. Meanwhile, Scythe Faraday goes to the Library of Congress and discovers a blind spot in the Thunderhead's programming, accidentally revealing that blind spot to the Thunderhead, which has a camera in the room. Goddard and Rand has brought Rowan to Endura with them in order to present him as a gift to the Grand Council. But the night before the inquest, Rand attempts to seduce Goddard, and of course he rejects her. And of course, in a fit of pique, Rand frees Rowan from his captivity. Goddard is outraged when he notices Rowan's absence from the following morning and gleans Brahms. Dying didn't make him any smarter as a villain. In the World Council chamber, Citra and Goddard both speak their cases. The Grand Slayers decide that Goddard must complete an apprenticeship before becoming a true Scythe again. This disqualifies Goddard from his candidacy, so Scythe Curie becomes High Blade of Midmerica. But their decision doesn't matter for beans because Goddard has set up a technological attack on Endura and the buoyancy control of the island crashes. Boom! The Grand Slayers die, many people die, much panic is had. Scythe Curie locks Citra and Rowan in the Vault of Relics and Futures so that their bodies would be preserved and they could be revived later on after they go deadish. Then she leads the other Scythes to glean themselves with honor. The Thunderhead begins screaming around the world, which the Tonists view as the great resonance they have always worshipped. Every single human is marked as unsavory and loses their connection to the Thunderhead, except Grace and Tolliver, whom the Thunderhead has chosen to trust. And thus ends Book 2. Like I say, it was a great read, even if I rolled my eyes during the resurrection of Goddard. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. But I also debated the book philosophically speaking. And so, let's unpack some of the core themes of the world and the book as I saw them, starting with the frequent argument that death is necessary for life to have meaning, along with a corollary additional argument that scarcity of time is what makes humans productive. The prevailing sentiment in the world of Scythedom, and frankly in a lot of philosophy, is that death is the salt that gives life its flavor. The argument goes that if you have forever, you'll just sit on a couch eating immortal Cheetos until your brains turn to mush. Shusterman's world seems to lean into this. The mortal age is looked back upon as a time of frantic, beautiful creativity, fueled by the ticking clock. Since then, the world has become pretty stagnant, as I understand the lore. The Thunderhead came online and put a whole bunch of stuff together, making humanity immortal, but since then, no dramatically new technological leaps have been made. Heck, humanity can't even get off planet because apparently humans can't cope without the Thunderhead. Watch that AI addiction, kids. Anyway, I'm calling a massive but actually on that humans need death line. First, let's look at Thomas Nagel. You know, it's probably Nagel, but I don't know. I can't remember right now if he was actually English, which would make it Nagel because they'd anglicize it, or if he was actually still German or Dutch, and it would be Nagel with a G. But since I know it's probably Nagel, I'm going to pronounce it as Nagel. And then I'm going to look up afterwards what nationality he was, because it escapes me right this moment. Anyway, so first, let's look at Thomas Nagel. In his essay Death, Nagel makes a point that is so simple, it's almost frustrating. If life is good, then more of it is better. He argues that death isn't some mystical finishing touch on a masterpiece. It's a deprivation. If you enjoy a sunset, you don't enjoy it more because you might go blind tomorrow. You enjoy it because sunsets are great. In the world of Thunderhead, the old guard scythes like Curie and Faraday haven't lost their edge because they've lived centuries. They've actually become more refined. They prove Nagel's point. The good of life is cumulative. You don't need the threat of the void to appreciate the beauty of the present. Then we have Michel de Montaigne. This guy was the king of lifelong learning, long before it was a corporate buzzword. Montaigne believed the purpose of life was to explore the self and the world. Now, apply that to the world of Arc of a Scythe. In our world, you have to pick a career by 22 and hope you don't hate it by 65 because time is running out. But in a post-mortality world, especially one where you don't need to work because the basics are provided, you can be a master glassblower for 50 years, a theoretical physicist for a century, and a concert cellist for another 80. The book treats the stagnation of the population as a byproduct of immortality, but I'd argue it's actually a byproduct of the Thunderhead doing all the heavy lifting and believing itself to be perfect. Human curiosity doesn't have an expiration date. If I had 5,000 years, I wouldn't be done learning. I'd finally have gotten through my TBR and be ready to create a new pile of books to read. Scarcity of time isn't the motivator, it's a distractor. And Montaigne proved that. He didn't need to work, he was rich. He just loved learning and lived to learn. But the Thunderhead, being the omniscient everything that lets no one starve or suffer, is, I think, trying to make a point about lacking a purpose in life. Like, without survival, without meaningful labor, your life is empty. That kind of vibe is what I was getting from the book. And I think scythes are supposed to show us that they have a clear purpose in life, and because of that, they are the most vibrant characters in the world. No one else has a purpose, so they just nihilistically live as long as they don't meet a scythe. But the scythes know their job in the world and find it meaningful, so they live vibrant, purposeful lives. I reject that premise, and to explain why, I'm going to draw on my favorite existential grump, Albert Camus. Camus' whole deal was the absurd. The conflict between our hungry search for meaning and the cold, silent indifference of the universe. In Thunderhead, the universe isn't silent. The Thunderhead is positively chatty. But meaning remains just as elusive, if not even more so. What is your meaning when you don't even have to shift off your couch to survive? And in my worldview, that meaning is something every person has to decide for themselves every day. Whether you live 80 years or 8,000, you still need to wake up and decide that life is worth living. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus claims that the realization of the absurd, the indifference of the universe to our lives, does not justify suicide, and instead requires us to revolt. He compares the absurdity of man's life with the situation of Sisyphus, the sucker from Greek mythology, who was condemned to push a boulder up a mountain each day, only to see it roll down again just as it nears the top. The essay concludes, the struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Real talk. I love absurdism. I've had people say to me that absurdism will make you nihilistic. But for me, it really doesn't. I find hope and agency in the understanding that there is nothing dictating the purpose of my life. I own my life. It's mine. And it's up to me to find my purpose and give myself joy. And I love that. I would hate to live with something like the Thunderhead that just gives me answers. Pushing the boulder up the hill is an act of rebellion. Living forever doesn't solve the absurd. It just gives you a longer timeline to rebel. So no, I don't think we need death to give meaning to life. I don't think we need death to provide the necessary impetus to do stuff. I think we just need to imagine Sisyphus happy. But I'm not done with the Thunderhead yet. Next, I want to talk about that entity itself. The Thunderhead claims to be perfect. It says it makes no mistakes. And for most of the population, that's a comforting thought. But this brings us to the benevolent dictator trap. The Thunderhead isn't just a ruler. It's a ceiling. The biggest misconception in this world is that the Thunderhead knows everything. It doesn't. It knows everything humanity has already figured out. It's the world's most sophisticated rear-view mirror. Think about it. The Thunderhead is worried about the world running out of resources. If the Thunderhead were truly an engine of progress, it would have solved the resource scarcity that necessitates the Scythe in the first place. Why are we still killing people to manage the population? Why haven't we colonized the stars? Why isn't there a Dyson sphere or terraforming tech? Why haven't we built out a new home that orbits the Earth if people can't travel off-planet to other colonies? There are so many solutions to this problem of overpopulation. The reason why we haven't solved the problem is because humans have outsourced their curiosity. When you have a God that gives you the correct answer to every problem, you stop asking the questions that lead to breakthroughs. The Thunderhead is a massive database, but it lacks the curiosity that drives human innovation. It has all the memory, but none of the imagination, clearly. In our world, we're terrified of the singularity, the moment AI surpasses us. In Ark of a Scythe, the singularity already happened, but I would argue it's a bit of a dud. It didn't lead to the transcendence of the human condition. It led to a permanent plateau. Yeah, people are immortal, and it's a sort of utopic society, if you ignore the murder class, but humans no longer seek answers because they falsely believe all answers have been found because the Thunderhead exists. Like, my guys, all the tech is built based on knowledge from us, from humans. New tech needs new knowledge, which needs human curiosity. By being everyone's nursemaid and claiming total omniscience, the Thunderhead has created a nursery. Humans can still think, sure, but they've outsourced their collective memory and conflict resolution. We see this in how easily Goddard manipulates the system. The Thunderhead can see every camera feed, but it can't foresee the chaotic, irrational cruelty of a man like Goddard. And here is the part where I might get gleaned by the old god Scythe for this opinion. Goddard had a point. Wait, hear me out. Goddard is a genocidal, egomaniacal crackpot villain. He exploits boredom and fragile systems to bring it down. By no means is he a good guy, but he is the only person actually moving the world. And frankly, The Thunderhead's own internal musings make it clear that if the Scythe are the way to control the population, then Goddard levels of gleaning will be necessary in due time, on a date the Thunderhead has calculated. The Thunderhead has spent centuries keeping the world in a state of perfection. But it's not perfection. The population is growing, the resources are finite. The Thunderhead refuses to limit births. It has run the calculations and knows the planet will run out of space. But because of its own programming, its I make no mistakes ego, and its non-interference laws, it does nothing. It just watches the ship sail towards the ice while it polishes the deck chairs. Look, I'm not a believer in accelerationism, but that system of Scythe needed someone to poke it with a stick, as we saw when we saw the Grand Council. And that's what I think Goddard provided in the context of the world. It wasn't a good stick, he didn't solve any problems, but he did at least expose the whole stinking mess by showing how easily it could be hijacked and abused. Without that abuse, the Scythe might have stayed in place indefinitely and resulted in gleaning one death for each birth, which pretty much makes it a mortal world again. And speaking of corruption in the system, let's talk about the unsavories and those awful clubs, because this is where the Thunderhead world building gets really cynical and really interesting. In The Matrix, in the second or third movie, which was bleh, but had some interesting world building, the architect explains that the first version of the simulation of the Matrix was a perfect paradise, but humans kept trying to wake up from it. They needed a glitch, a place for the rebels to go, to keep the rest of the sheep in line. The unsavory designation is the Thunderhead's version of Zion from the Matrix. It's controlled rebellion. In the awful clubs, there are people paid to play the part of normal citizens that the unsavories get to abuse. It gives the unsavories an outlet for violence, and it gives people with a touch of masochism or a submissive bent a safe place to be abused. And that part I was actually okay with. But then we discover that the Thunderhead also does stuff like schedule unsavories to have to wait in queues and stuff like that, so that they can have a reason to complain. And that was where I started side-eyeing that AI real hard. By labeling someone unsavory, the Thunderhead was gaslighting them. It actively manufactures their dissatisfaction. It schedules them to wait in lines, imposes arbitrary rules, and ensures that they have something to complain about. It's like a parent who provokes a tantrum just to have an excuse to punish the child. The Thunderhead isn't just managing dissent, it's curating it, ensuring it stays within acceptable boundaries. This isn't benevolence, it's gaslighting. Does that sound familiar? Think about how social media algorithms amplify outrage to keep users engaged, or how societies create outgroups to maintain cohesion. The unsavories are the Thunderhead's version of this, controlled opposition. It's all theatre, a carefully staged rebellion that keeps the real status quo intact. It is also why what happens to Grayson Tolliver is so messed up. The Thunderhead uses him to bypass its own rules and then discards him into the unsavory pile. It claims it can't interact with Grayson because of the law, but the Thunderhead is the law. It could rewrite those laws. Sure, it's in the laws that it can't rewrite the laws. It's all very biblical. But hear me out. The Thunderhead programmed itself. It designed itself. And allow me to lean on Sartre for just a moment by saying that changes couldn't be made by claiming that these rules were absolute. The Thunderhead exists in bad faith. It treats its self-imposed constraints as metaphysical inevitabilities rather than ethical choices. This is especially relevant because in Book 3, We see the Thunderhead work around those laws on razor-thin bullshit excuses. So they're not really laws, they're chosen boundaries. And chosen boundaries remain the responsibility of the chooser. The unsavory system isn't just cynical. It's a microcosm of the Thunderhead stagnation. A truly progressive society wouldn't need a permanent underclass of broken people. It would ask, why are they broken? There are already charted territories with different rules from the norm. Why can't these people live in such a place? But the Thunderhead doesn't ask that question because it doesn't want the answer. It's not interested in fixing the root causes of dissatisfaction. It's interested in maintaining control. And that's the real tragedy. In its quest for perfection, the Thunderhead has created a world where the only way to feel alive is to be marked as an unsavory or to be a killer Scythe. And I think the book and I are actually in agreement on this point. I think this was written with irony in mind rather than being, for real. My takeaway from this was we should not outsource our curiosity, even if we do outsource our memory. A benevolent dictator, omniscient or not, is still a dictator. So, where does this leave us as Endura sinks and the Thunderhead starts its global temper tantrum? Ultimately, Thunderhead is a cautionary tale, but maybe not one the characters in the book think it is. The tragedy isn't that the Scythedom fell into corruption. The tragedy is that stability became so optimized that rupture was the only visible catalyst. When Endura sinks, it's the inevitable result of a world that refused to move until a monster broke it completely. And when the Thunderhead marks everyone as unsavory, it finally stops being a nursemaid and starts being a judge. It's the ultimate, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed from a digital god. But perhaps being unsavory, being cut off from the easy, stagnant answers of the machine, is exactly what humanity needs to start asking questions again, to start being curious, to start making our own mistakes again, instead of living in the shadow of the Thunderhead's perfect ones. Because if Sisyphus is happy, it's not because the boulder is light. It's because he's the one choosing to push it. So here's the question. If you lived forever, what would you do with your time? Would you let a system like the Thunderhead decide for you? Or would you grab that boulder and start pushing? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the stagnant mind of the omniscient, make sure to hit all the good buttons down below. For those of you who want these philosophical deep dives to be delivered straight to your brain with no Nimbus agent required, sign up for my newsletter. It only comes out 4 times a year, once per season, so I promise not to clutter your inbox, just your thoughts. You can find the link in the description. And stay tuned, because next month we're finishing what we started. We're diving into the final book of the Ark of a Scythe trilogy, The Toll. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.